I just wanted to say one thing before I launch into my very short talk, you'll be pleased to know, about liability. Somebody raised the question of liability, and will this help us if liability is established? The polluter pays principle, in other words. And I can tell you that on the basis of the experience in Germany, it is the key. In Germany, they've had an internal legal discussion going on for years. A few years ago, there were a series of court cases in which it was established that any farmer growing GM crops could be held directly liable for any damages to other non-GM crops or organic crops, or even somebody who ate the GM food and got sick or something. The farmer can be held liable, and that was established. And as far as I know, this is the only legislation of its kind anywhere in the world. And virtually overnight, all GM cultivation stopped in Germany, and it is not restarted again. Nobody wants to be held liable. So, yeah. Okay. I've been asked to talk about the scientific aspects of GM, the scientific evidence that we have against GM. I'm not a scientist myself. My specialism is in talking to scientists and trying to translate that for the layperson. But I can tell you where we're up to with regard to what we know scientifically about GM and the effects. And I and two genetic engineers, one of those is Michael Antonio over here, actually got together and wrote a book about it, and you see a big pile of them there. That's GMO Myths and Truths. Please take away a copy with you, and if you know anybody else who could do with a copy, then take one for them as well. They are free.
Second edition?
They've been printed as a, yeah, it's the second edition, so it's not the up-to-date edition. If you want the brand new up-to-date one, you have to go on Amazon and buy it. But this one is for free. So when GM crops were first introduced in the mid-1990s, we made some science-based predictions, and this was based on what the scientists were telling us. The anti-GMO movement all over the world was based on science, and it still is based on science. So if anybody ever tries to tell you that we are anti-science, you can say with absolute confidence, on the contrary, our movement was started with scientists, and it is still underpinned by very, very good science. We made these predictions. We said that GM crops posed risks to public health and the environment, that in the case of herbicide-tolerant GM crops, which is over 85% of all GM crops grown in the world, the weeds would very quickly evolve resistance to the herbicides that were sprayed upon them. And this would in turn force farmers to spray more and more herbicides, and also mixtures of toxic herbicides to try to control the resistant weeds. We also predicted that in the case of GM Bt insecticidal crops, they are engineered to express an insecticide, the insect pests would quickly evolve resistance, and that would force farmers to spray insecticides. Needless to say, we were right on all these points, and there's very good scientific evidence to back all that up. I want to say a little bit about the animal feeding trials. This is an area that, for some reason unknown to me, activists tend to steer away from. They don't feel confident in talking about the animal feeding studies. Actually, for me, this is the most intuitively worrying and important aspect of the whole GM thing, that the foods produced from these technologies are potentially not safe to eat. I'm not saying that all GM crops are going to be toxic, that would be nonsense, but there is a risk that they will be. Plants are very good at making their own toxins. They do this naturally to protect themselves against pests and diseases. And in the case of GM crops, numerous things can go wrong. That means that that plant is unexpectedly toxic. And indeed, the animal feeding studies that have been done on GM crops do find that that is the case quite often. Particularly the effects we see in the liver and the kidney. and the digestive system, as in the case of Pushti's potatoes, and also in terms of immune responses. This is a particular worry with the BT GM crops. They do seem to produce some kind of immune response. So 20 years after the introduction of GM crops, we still do not know whether the toxicity comes from something in the GM process itself, or from the herbicides used on herbicide-tolerant GM crops, or from that BT insecticidal toxin that's in BT crops. We do not know, in most cases, where the toxicity comes from. There's only been 2 experiments that have ever been done that have separated out those potential effects. And what was found was that there was a problem with the GM process itself. It unexpectedly created toxins. In 2015, this was a big event. The World Health Organization Cancer Agency, IARC, discovered that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen. 85% of all GM crops in the world are grown to tolerate glyphosate. And this is extremely worrying that we're eating this potential carcinogen every time we eat a herbicide-tolerant GM crop. In 2017, a peer-reviewed study showed that ultra-low doses of Roundup herbicide, which is based on glyphosate, causes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This was a study done by Michael Antoniou here, and it is very, very important. These doses of Roundup that were tested in the rats are so low that regulators say that they are safe for us to eat every day of our lives, for the rest of our lives. And these doses were found to cause fatty liver disease. This is a disease that now affects 25% of the population. It's seen as a new epidemic. So this is a pretty serious development. As far as I know, this is the first study ever to show that real-life, realistic doses of Roundup are directly causing a disease, potentially in humans.
Can I ask 25% of what population?
The US and also Europe. The figures are very similar. So GM crops have been found to have negative ecological effects. Particularly, they've had devastating effects on some species, wildlife species. In the US, the populations of monarch butterflies, which is this very iconic butterfly that every American knows, it's very pretty, it's orange. These populations have plummeted 90% in just 2 decades. And that is an amazing thing to happen for a species just to be virtually wiped out before our eyes. And this has happened largely because of the planting of Roundup-tolerant GM crops. The Roundup has killed the milkweed plant, which is the sole food plant of the monarch larvae. So basically GM has been responsible for virtually wiping out this species. GM crops, most of us have heard that GM crops have led to superweeds, particularly in the US and also South America. About half of US farmers in 2012 reported that they had superweeds on their land, and this was a problem. These are weeds that have evolved to be tolerant to the glyphosate herbicides that are sprayed on the GM crops. In some cases, the weeds have been so tough, you know, these things are thicker than a man's arm in some cases. And they're taller than a tall man. And they've had to go about them with machetes to try to chop them down. This is hand labour. They've gone back to needing hand labour in the fields just to weed the crops. I like to say that GM
right,
has...
that's very good, isn't it?
In one sense, yes, but in terms
when
of
you've
the...
got 100,000 acres on this.
This is it. In terms of the industrial farming system in the US, this is sending farming back to the Stone Age, and that's what I like to say. You know, GM is not progress, it's actually taking us back to a very primitive, in an unpleasant kind of way, form of farming. These superweeds have led the industry to develop GM crops that are tolerant to more than one herbicide. So now we have dicamba tolerant crops, 2,4-D tolerant crops. The dicamba situation is now terrible in the US for the last 2 years. These dicamba tolerant GM crops have been planted, and the farmers have been spraying dicamba herbicide, and it does not stay where it is put. So it has drifted and it's volatilized, so it's just basically turned into a gas overnight, and it goes up in the air, moves along and settles on somebody else's crop which is not dicamba tolerant and kills it. So there are trees, there are non-GM crops, there are all kinds of crops. Fruit trees are being killed by this stuff, and basically it is a catastrophe. Whichever way you look at it, this is just a disaster for farming. Pests have evolved resistance to the GM Bt insecticidal crops. In India, this has happened with Bt cotton, and it's been terrible. The cotton crop has been attacked by a pest called pink bollworms, which the GM Bt crop was supposed to be resistant to. It was supposed to kill these worms. In actual fact, what's happening is that the worms are now living off this crop. They are surviving. In India, the Bt cotton situation has led to this double tragedy. In the early years, what happened was that the seeds, the GM seeds, are very expensive, and also the farmers have to buy these pesticides, chemical inputs, to spray on them. And all this is extremely expensive, so the farmers have got into debt, and that has led to a spate of farmer suicides. Now at GM Watch, we were very, very hesitant about actually blaming the GM crops for the farmer suicides, because we felt that the evidence wasn't really in. We thought that, there was some evidence suggesting that was the case, but on the other hand, there's lots of farmer suicides did exist before GM crops. However, now there is a peer-reviewed study which actually shows that the level of Bt cotton adoption has gone in tandem with farmer suicides. So it's pretty convincing now that GM Bt crops have led to farmer suicides. Now there's a big problem in that the pink bollworm pest has descended on Indian cotton, the GM Bt cotton, and as a result the farmers have had to go out and spray insecticides, and they've sprayed very toxic mixtures of insecticides, and this has directly led to the death by pesticide poisoning of at least 50 farmers, and a further 800 farmers have been hospitalized. So in India, basically GM Bt cotton is being thrown out. The farmers are going back to native varieties where they can, or they're switching crops, they're just planting other things. Sorry, I've got to finish. And GM Bt cotton's also been thrown out of Burkina Faso because it gave very poor quality fibre. I just want to say one thing to you, which is the ultimate anti-GMO and pesticide propaganda antidote. This is the ultimate antidote that you can all use. It works brilliantly. I've tried it, it works. What they will start out saying is that we need GM crops and we need genome-edited crops in order to feed the 9 billion people in 2050. The answer to that, of course, is that we already produce enough food to feed between 10 billion and 14 billion people. I'm not sure where is the absolute figure, but between those numbers. And that is more than we will ever need. So we don't need to increase food production. We just need to solve the problem of poverty, which means that people cannot afford to buy the food that is available. And thank you very much.
Right.